Hello everybody and welcome to this week's Motor Trade Radio podcast powered by eBay Motors Group. It is Saturday the 26th of February and you're joined by myself, Philip Nothard.
And me, Curtis Hutchinson. This is episode 10, season 8 of Motor Trade Radio, bringing you all the chatter that matters. And once again, we've gathered together this week's big car retailing stories across the franchised and independent sectors for you to enjoy all in one place, on demand, on your podcast feed.
So we've got some good shout outs this week. I mean, we've fairly short show because of our this week we've got our interview with Derren Martin, Cap HPI's valuation guru, who's going to take us through February's used car pricing trends and give us a little bit of perspective of what to expect in March, and that'll be on the second half of today's podcast. So do stay tuned for that. And we also want to give a shout out to the poet that didn't know it. With our friend of the show, Steve Whitten. As I say, he shared his love last week. So if you haven't listened to last week's podcast, you're missing it for sure. Do listen back. Still available on your download. So it went down well, as it always does with Steve.
It did, yes, and he did hint at a possible poetry book. So maybe this is a story that will be worth following. Who knows?
Who knows, eh? Who knows?
And also a big shout out because it's plate change month almost. So on Tuesday we'll see the introduction of the 22 plate. So a lot of you out there are going to be incredibly busy sorting out stock, paperwork, vehicles in readiness for the plate change.
Yeah, and it is interesting because without sharing too much of the interview with Derren coming later on in the show, but we do talk about that March market and the variance between manufacturers. So I suspect there'll be some people listening this morning that probably haven't got a great deal of order bank going into March, and others that represent a different manufacturer that maybe have a better order bank than they may have expected at this time last year. So good luck to everybody out there. I mean, at the end of the day, new month, a little bit of an uptake in new vehicle registrations isn't a bad thing. It will generate some activity and will generate some much needed part exchanges as well. So good luck to you all on Tuesday when we get the new plate.
Yeah, and interestingly, as an aside, you and I have been in this industry for a long, long, long time, and we both were struggling
to work out what's what.
which plate it was, but it is the 22 plate.
Yeah, it's not the easiest thing. It's not the easiest thing to spot either, is it, on the roads? I mean, that's not what you were saying. No, it's just they don't really stand out like they used to. But you know what? The same people that came up with WLTP at a new registration month, taxation changes at the new month, and RDE at new months did come up with probably new plates as well, but anyway, we'll leave that one for another conversation.
We'll blame them anyway, Phil.
Yeah,
how's
exactly,
that?
Exactly. So, I mean, what have we got on the headlines today other than the interview with Derren Martin then?
Okay, so headlines today are from AM and Car Dealer. The first one, which we'll get to in a moment, is dealers that offer add-ons more likely to be recommended. We'll have a look at just how many car dealerships there are in the UK. So there's an exclusive list of every franchise car dealer in the UK. We've got an update on the story we talked about last week about Arnold Clark. So if you recall last week, Arnold Clark were exiting Toyota, and the franchise had been picked up by Virtue under the Macklin Motors. But we've got an update on that because they're also exiting Ford. And final story for today is close to half of car buyers remain on the fence about eco issues, finds an eBay Motors Group report.
So, as you say there, Curtis, you're going over to AM Online, and this is the story that's come from the insight and survey from Judge Services. So that's dealers that offer add-ons more likely to be recommended. Now, there is a nice visual which actually does break that the scores down in there in terms of that question and answer in terms of that promoter score as well.
Yeah, there's a very good visual, which actually I'll share on social media. So by the time this goes out, just head over to my LinkedIn feed because it'll be there. So as you say, this is from Judge Service, and I helped the guys put together this particular release that was picked up by AM. And the gist behind the story is that car buyers are more likely to recommend dealers that offer add-ons than those that do not, which is kind of counterintuitive because I think one of the assumptions is that if you try and upsell, if you try and introduce add-ons into the negotiations, customers can be turned off by it. But research that Judge Service have carried out shows that the opposite is actually the truth of the matter. So just looking at service plans, and this one is fascinating. So one of the questions is, were you made aware of the service plan saving package? And of those that responded, 14% said no, they weren't. And as a result of that, their promoter score, so their likelihood of recommending that particular dealer to friends, family, was only 55.5%. But when you look at those who said yes, they were offered it, so that's 85.9% were offered it, their promoter score shoots up to 85.3%. So, some fascinating results in this survey.
Yeah, and as you say there, the header is obviously about add-ons, and that similar result is replicated through the gap insurance and cosmetic repair insurance, etc. That same sort of jump does accelerate in terms of that promoter score. Whereas, if you're offered finance, where you've got an 18.6% that said they weren't offered finance compared to an 81.4% that were, the promoter score is still reasonably high at 68.5%. So I think there is a clear comparison there that the offering these add-ons does give your dealer that acceleration in promotion, doesn't it, across the network?
Yeah, and hopefully this will give sort of more confidence to anyone in that sort of face-to-face sales environment that customers may actually want what you're offering them. That traditional barrier may not be there, and it's worth pointing out that this research it's come from a new report that's only just been published by Judge Service called the Power of Customer Satisfaction 2022 report, and it's actually based on almost 600,000 car buyer surveys that have been carried out between 2016 and 2021. So it's a massive piece of research, and that is actually all available online. You just need to head over to the Judge Service website and you can download it.
Yeah, and interesting in the story itself, there's a reference there and a comment from Neil that talks about test drives. So they're saying that test drives remain highly valued by customers, with the research showing dealers that with high promoter scores proactively offer test drives. Now, obviously, Neil then follows that up with we know that bums in seats sell cars, yet test drives are not always being offered, and this can have a negative impact on the dealer's promoter score, as well as potentially losing them sales. So I know Neil's very keen on that test drive element of that dealer environment, isn't he?
Yeah, very much so. And we were talking about the plate change month, and if you're not offering test drives, you've really got to be asking yourselves why.
Yeah, definitely. So moving on to the next story there, and we're heading over to Car Dealer, and this is a reference on some exclusive 2022 data that they've got hold of, and this is how many car dealers does each brand have. Now, we know that the market has been consolidating in a normal marketplace of about 2% per annum. We know that the acceleration of the pandemic has certainly accelerated some of this consolidation. And like we've just been talking there previously about Arnold Clark's, there's continually a restructuring in there of partners within that franchise world. And we know that things like Stellantis and others are in this sort of, consolidated market where they've got 14 brands, and how do they best represent them 14 brands, and where do they need open points. But conversely to that, we've got new entrants as well coming into the UK market. So some interesting findings here, isn't there?
Yeah, and you are right. Yeah, when was it never so? I mean, I've been in this market for a long time, as indeed you have, and the market's been consolidating for as long as any of us can remember. But I guess the interesting thing about this particular story is that Car Dealer have done their own research, and they've actually come up with a figure. So they're saying that the number of dealerships fell from 4,796 franchise points last year to 4,562, which is, by my calculation, that's a shortfall of 234, although in the story it says 209, so I'm not quite sure what that's referencing. But it does go on to say that, you know, a major contributor to this was Mitsubishi, obviously withdrawing its new car sales franchise last year, you know, so that affected 100 sites. It also points to Vauxhall closing 58 sites. So you can see where the numbers start to come from.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. But they do go on in the story, and like I say, we've seen that with the Vauxhall, etc., and Fiat, Abarth, and Peugeot, and DS all sort of dropping in representation. But they do also reference that there were 15 manufacturers who grew their network with MG topping it, and we know we've talked about the growth of MG in the UK market, but they're also talking about the increase in other brands such as Subaru, Alpina, being another two that have actually increased their representation in the UK market over the last 12 months. So, I think there is still investment, there's still growth, but there is a restructuring taking place, isn't there?
There is indeed, yeah, which ties in rather neatly. It's almost as though we planned it this way, Phil. It ties in very neatly with the next story, which is from AM, and the headline there is "More Arnold Clark car retail franchise exits to follow Ford and Toyota." So, as we said at the top of the show, last week we talked about Arnold Clark exiting Toyota. Well, in this story, there's confirmation that it's also exiting Ford. But the comments from Eddie Hawthorne, the chief exec of Arnold Clark, does rather suggest that these won't be total losses because they are retaining sites and they are looking at other franchises to put in them. So it's a parting of the waves with certainly Ford and Toyota and possibly others.
Yeah, but I think it's clear that, taking this on a negative, which obviously the media did last week, and I know at the time that there wasn't a communication coming out of Arnold Clark's, was there, in terms of a response to that Toyota and the rumours around Ford. But we did ask the question, what's happening with the sites, didn't we, in terms of
Yes.
those open points or open sites that would leave. But they've made it fairly clear in the story that they are looking at other manufacturers to fill those sites. Now, we've just been talking previous story there about the increase in open points for people like MG, Subaru. We know that Arnold Clark's have been putting a lot of focus in their EV proposition and the brands they operate within that EV sector. So it's going to be very interesting to see what they do as a business, particularly with that Ford and Toyota open points that they're going to be left with.
Yeah, and Eddie Hawthorne is quoted in the story as saying, in terms of the manufacturers that we have got an issue with, it was just a case that we were headed in different directions. We've been with both Ford and Toyota for a number of years, and I have huge respect for both brands, but it was time to go. And he does go on to say, I'm sure there will be 2 or 3 more franchises that we'll have to step aside from. But as you say, he does talk about refranchising some of the points that will become vacant.
Yeah, and there's one thing that we know with Arnold Clark's, they do move very quickly on things, don't they? And they've certainly got a very, very strong hold of their network,
Yes,
and play a very significant part in the proposition of the volume of vehicles, both new and used, going through the UK market as well. So very much one of the dominant players. So I'm sure where they are losing franchises, there'll be a franchise behind waiting to snap up the opportunity.
Yeah, because Eddie makes it quite clear that he is not downsizing. There will not be a loss of franchise outlets in the Arnold Clark network.
Yeah, definitely. So, final story of today before we head over to the interview with Derren there. And we're going back over to Car Dealer. Now, this is a story from eBay Motors Group and some of their research that they've been working on with their 2,000 in-market buyers. And this is close to half of car buyers remain on the fence about eco issues. Now, we're talking about EV and this move to sustainability, etc. But this is some very interesting findings here from eBay Motors Group.
Yeah, definitely. So this is quite a major piece of research that they've put together, and I've helped them with some of the press releases on this, and I've seen the research, and it is comprehensive. So it's called The Role of the Environment and Sustainability in Car Buying Journey, and as you say, it's made up of responses from a fairly detailed questionnaire that they put into the market of 2,000 in-market buyers. And what they've done is, within the research, is they've identified three groups of buyers who are differentiated by their attitudes towards the environment and climate change. So, yeah, this is very pertinent. It's very relevant with, this shift from ICE to electric and FEV. So what they've done is as I say, they've identified three different groups of buyers. So committed made up 25.4%, on the fence 44.8%, and dismissive 29.8%. So they're all self-explanatory, but it's just interesting to see how this feeds into their decision-making process, and what's actually guiding them.
Yeah, and it's great in the research because we talk about new cars, but then we talk about used vehicles and all around that EV sector and who needs to play a part. We know that the manufacturers are doing a significant job in new of trying to get that message across. We know what's happening in terms of the UK government, be it good or bad. We'll stay on the side of that one for now. But what you have got is when they talk about researching an EV purchase, and there's a finding there that says committed, buyers will look at least three main sources of support. One, visiting the dealership, 49%. A review of website, we're at 48%. And a car search website at 41%. So I think that's very, very clear that they're very split in terms of that, where they're going to do their research when looking at EVs, be it new or be it used, that there's still a big role to play from the dealer presence and when the customer does visit the showroom, and on their website, as well as other search websites as well that the consumer is going to be looking at.
Yeah, and of the other two groups, on the fence buyers are less likely to exhibit strong views on green matters, whilst acknowledging some of the issues, but behavioural change is mixed within this group. And this sector is more likely to be female, have children aged up to 9 years old, and an average household income of just under £41,000. And they have a slight bias towards buying used cars. And the third group, dismissive buyers, believe that climate change is exaggerated. They've not made any positive changes and think their actions are pointless. So this segment is more likely to be male, aged 18 to 34, with below average household incomes of around £37,000, and they are more likely to buy used cars aged over 2 years old.
Yeah, and there's a little comment there. There's a few references there from Dermot Kelleher in the piece that is there, but he does make a thing that while dismissive buyers are unlikely to be swayed, it's still worth discussing electric alternatives to combustion engines from a performance or running cost perspective, as that might plant the seed for future purchases. So, we know that the deadline is 2030 currently and 2035 for removal of all alternative of all combustion relevant vehicles. But all right, it might not be ready for them today or in the next 5 years, but at some point they may consider switching when the infrastructure or their driving behaviours change to an alternative fuel or an EV. So it's worth having the conversations and planting the seed for future purchases. Don't dismiss it today just because it's not adequate for today's, driving behaviours in infrastructure for that customer.
Yeah, and if you want to see the report in full, do head over to ebaymotorsgroup.co.uk and you can download it for free from there.
Definitely. So that's the headlines for today, isn't it? We're heading over to the break now, Curtis.
We are indeed, and after the break, stay tuned for Derren Martin. Meanwhile, you're listening to All the Chatter That Matters on Motor Trade Radio, powered by eBay Motors Group. This is your weekly one-stop shop for all the biggest car retailing headlines from across the media, available on demand wherever you are on your podcast feed. It's time now to catch up with Derren Martin, Director of Valuations at CAP HPI, for our monthly look at used car values. Welcome back, Derren.
Thank you, Curtis.
Hi, Derren. You okay?
Hi, Phil.
Good to have you back. You've been busy this week because your name keeps popping up in the media. In any story, it seems, about used car prices, and you're the man.
Well, the national press are very keen to get information now, aren't they? Because it is quite a big story about what's happened to used car values over the last year or so, and with cars above list. And there was an article in the Daily Mail this week about the mainstream cars, or the highest volume cars, and how much they've gone up by. So, yeah, we're pretty popular for that data. So it's never been more interesting, has it?
And particularly because it has influence on inflation. In the UK,
yes.
Whereas some countries, it doesn't. The used values don't actually have an impact on inflation, but it does in the UK. So yeah, it's definitely part of that bigger story, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
Now, Derren, by way of a recap, so we had those back-to-back monthly rises from March to October last year. We saw slight dips in November and December and no movement in January. So can you bring us up to date with the headline figure for February and maybe set the scene in terms of what dealers were telling you about stock levels and demand during the month?
Yeah, so the headline figure is a 0.3% reduction at 3 years old. And younger than that. So 0.3. Interestingly, in the early part of the month of February, values were going up very slightly. So they have kind of turned around the middle of the month and are now heading down. But that is only the headline figure at 3 years and younger. At older ages, cars have still been appreciating, still been going up. So, and there's a lot of variance by sort of price point and that type of thing, and also by sector, as always. But to your question on what dealers are telling us, stock levels, I think, are okay. They're not overstocking at the moment. I think there's a little bit of wariness. I would say that with demand, the consumer demand is just about okay. Sales rates are just about okay. It's been described as sort of a 7 out of 10 month, really. So it's pretty steady, not going through the roof and not setting any records. And because of that, the buying of vehicles in the trade is similar, really. So they are picking off vehicles that are good value or look reasonable value, that are in good condition, but there isn't a massive amount of buying for stock or buying in bulk, because a lot of dealers have still got cars that they bought last year that owe them a fair bit of money because they bought at a peak, and they haven't sold all of those yet. So it's just about okay with regards to demand, and that's probably why values have dropped off slightly, because it's not going through the roof like it was last year.
And we were just talking about press coverage and demand for what's happening in the marketplace, and more recently there's been sort of media coverage talking about that the highest appreciating models over the last sort of month or so. What are your observations on how the different age segments and vehicle types have performed over the last month? Because I know you've kind of called out the pricing position as well in the editorial this month.
Yeah, it seems more relevant now to talk about price bands than it does to talk about age and mileage, really, because age and mileage is obviously a pointer to what's going on. But those a 3-year-old 60,000 mile car, that's a higher price band now than it was a year ago because of those extraordinary increases. So we've kind of broken it down this month by cheaper cars, maybe around sort of 12, 13,000 pounds and below. They've actually gone up in value on average, and that's pretty much across all sectors. So under £5,000, values have gone up by 3.3%, and between £5,000 and £10,000 by 1.2%, and they're over like around the £100 mark. So it's not a lot, but it's continuing to increase off the back of what's happened over that last year. You've then got that sort of middle ground of 15 to 20 and higher, up to sort of £30,000, and those have seen more pressure on them. And as I say, they're now older cars with higher mileage than they would have been a year ago. So we've seen drops there of around sort of 0.7, 0.8% at that sort of 15 to 20, 20 to £30,000 mark. And then you've got the real top end above sort of £50,000, and they've been really, really steady and even gone up slightly on average. And you kind of look at that as maybe you look at the economic situation, cost of living, those cheaper cars, necessity purchases, and maybe people downgrading as well. You look at dealers, they could buy two £7,000 cars instead of a £15,000 car and make more money. So two instead of buying one, and make strong margins on those still. So it's that middle ground really where those cars, to me, they start to look expensive now. And with people looking at their cost of living, that maybe they are looking at cheaper cars. And obviously at that top end, they're probably not too bothered about the cost of living if you're going to buy an expensive car. So it's really, you could look at it and say it's two-tiered, but I think it's three-tiered really. You've got cheaper cars doing well, you've got that middle ground looking expensive, and then you've got the real top end that are doing just about steady.
And I know we mentioned it, and I know we mentioned it last month. We had we talked about obviously that increase in the older cars or the average age of vehicle, but and what that impact was on terms of funding for dealers. Do you think that is still having a bit of an influence in terms of that price banding, or do you think it is purely because is it purely driven by that consumer demand and cost of living and things like that, or do you think there's still a little bit of caution and as you put it, that nervousness of those, because a 3-year-old car is more expensive than it was 12 months ago, not just for the customer, but actually for the dealer to stock now, isn't it?
I think, in my view, it's just that those cars look expensive. Yes, they are obviously expensive to stock, and that has to be taken into consideration. But I would say there's probably a bit of nervousness. And if you think about the cars that have gone up by the most, they have probably got the potential to come down by the most if values start to drop later in the year. So I think there's just a little bit of nervousness about replacing what is really an expensive, almost sort of mainstream bog standard vehicle that's going to cost you sort of £20,000, whereas you can buy it at the cheaper end, and you're probably going to sell that a lot quicker off your forecourt as well, because the cheaper cars are selling quicker. So I think there's lots of considerations to have, but probably the main reason is that cars aren't flying off the shelves, so they are just looking to sort of cherry pick the replacements really, and it's probably those cheaper cars that just look a little bit more appealing really to the dealers to buy.
And Derren, in terms of the actual sectors, from the editorial, it looks though it was a challenging month for certainly some SUV models, but MPVs, that was a sector that was very much on the wane in the new car market, but it continues to strengthen in the used car sector. And this is a point that we've covered a couple of times over recent months, but it's still got that strength. So what's actually driving that, do you think?
Yeah, they're probably still the two most interesting sectors to look at, SUVs and MPVs. MPVs are still cheap in comparison to SUVs. I mean, they've gone up a lot in value, but they are still a cheaper looking vehicle. And they're quite niche almost now, because the new cars don't really make them to the same degree as they used to. So there's less of them around. They're older and they're cheaper, and they're a good purchase, especially if you're considering going away in this country still, rather than booking a foreign holiday. You look at a Zafira; it's got the seat configuration that you probably want, and still looks like a good reasonable vehicle, even though it has gone up considerably in price. Others like the Alhambra, again older vehicles, but looking reasonable value for money. And we've seen some increases again this month with MPVs, not across the board. I mean, within our live data, you've got some that have gone up and some that have gone down. The average is slightly up, but some examples that have gone up are Combo Life, the Touran diesel, Toyota Verso Estate, Hyundai i800. They've all gone up this month, so that continues to be a reasonable sector. SUVs, we have seen some weakness on some SUVs. There's been probably more volume around of those cars, and as I say, they start to look expensive. If there's a lot of them around, demand isn't brilliant, and they look expensive, that's only going to cause one thing. And we've seen some weakness on Honda HR-V, Sportage, Peugeot 3008, and Mocha, that they've struggled a little bit. But some of those more niche vehicles where there is less volume around and perhaps they're a bit more aspirational, they've increased slightly. Q8, X6, and G-Class, some examples there. So you almost can't generalise really with the sectors, especially with SUVs, because there's a lot of moving parts within that. But yeah, in general, MPVs continue to perform okay, whereas SUVs are weakening slightly. But it is those sort of small and medium SUVs where there's the volume that are the ones that are struggling.
And I must ask you as a follow-up, Derren, because we do talk about the Zafira, but it seems to be on a monthly basis, because that has been one of the strongest performers in terms of appreciation over recent months. So how was the Zafira looking in February?
Yeah, Zafira's plateaued really. It seems it's pretty flat. Yeah, so I mean it's still gone up over 70% from a year ago, but at the moment it does seem to have probably reached its peak. I would say. I think it's depending on the model, it was slightly down or pretty stable. But when I say slightly, it's only sort of 0.5%, so it's negligible on that sort of vehicle. But yeah, maybe it's had those rises. I don't think it's going to be going up another 70%.
There you go, Phil. It's time to sell.
A bit like some of those share values we've been watching over recent months, isn't it? Time to get out of them. Time to get out. But anyway, yeah, no. So I mean, moving on to fuel type. You know, we can't have this interview with you, Derren, without talking about what EV, and you've pointed out in the editorial this month about EV values starting to soften. What is driving that, do you think?
Yeah, there's some examples that have softened there. So some Tesla products, in particular Model 3, and the Nissan Leaf. And it's really it's all about demand and supply with the used car market. And there's been quite a good supply of used vehicles in the wholesale market, and also lead times on some of that Tesla product are quite reasonable. It's been fairly well documented that on the new car side, they've performed very well over the last year. They haven't had some of the same issues with semiconductors. So where you can get a new car and there's plenty of full supply of used, then you do get a little bit of pressure on price there. So they have reduced. But then where new car supply remains limited, I would say. You've got lengthy lead times and used supply remains low. You've got models like the ID3 and the Q4 e-tron, and they've done okay. They've continued to increase. So again, you almost can't generalise with electric vehicles. There's lots of things happening there, but I do think that what we're seeing there is a kind of a theme for the year with new car supply. When new car supply comes back for various models, you're going to have the franchise dealers focusing on buying those, and not necessarily focusing on so many used cars. So and also they will generate part exchanges as well, so there'll be used car supply increases. So what you might see over the rest of the year is where where the new car supply is sorted out, and for particular models or manufacturers, that there might be some drops in used car values.
Yeah, it's a good observation. It is. I think that is it. That we're not in a normal supply, and we know that the supply of new cars is going to be, as you put it, very much brand or even model specific, because those vehicles arrive, and that won't generate a return of the market, it'll generate a supply for a particular model or derivative or manufacturer in pockets. So, no, it's a good observation that. And in terms of for the listeners, in terms of what's happening in the diesel market, then we know that the diesel share has continued to drop and does continue to drop, but obviously there's still a demand there in the used vehicle marketplace. What is that demand like, and appetite for used buyers now on diesel?
I think it's pretty good, actually. I think we've seen all the way through all these extraordinary price rises that petrol and diesel have behaved very similarly to each other. And obviously there are lower volumes of diesel cars, particularly at younger ages, but there's still a following for them. And if you're doing miles or you live in a more rural area, a hybrid or an EV doesn't necessarily work for you, then yeah, they're still doing well. And as volumes continue to drop, they may well continue in that vein as well. I think there's certainly not really an anti-diesel sort of feeling in the used car market. I think that they are still certainly still have their place, and there's plenty of the sole data that we receive. It's still around 40-45% of what we receive is still diesel, because obviously we're getting it at all ages. So there's plenty of diesel cars still selling.
And finally, Derren, what's the crystal ball saying about the coming weeks, especially as we head into March and the plate change, which begins from Tuesday? So do you see this downward trend continuing over the coming weeks?
It's all very much new car dependent, I think, in March. We are, I mean, we're constantly revising our short-term forecasts at the moment just to see what's happening. You speak to different manufacturers and different franchise dealers. Some are saying that supply is okay, like this will be maybe 70% of normal. Some are saying it's not okay, it's going to be sort of 50% of normal. It's definitely improved. And obviously, when you get new car supply in March, it will be better than in February and January, even if it's not as good as previous Marches, which will generate part exchanges. It will generate stock. If demand doesn't improve, then you're probably going to get some pressure on some of those prices. I think that's in the retail world, there are reductions happening without a doubt, because they're not moving fast enough off their shelves, and they've bought them a while ago now, so they're aging. So there's selective repricing in the retail market. I think margins are so strong that they can afford to do that. Yeah. So I would be saying that there's probably going to be a small downward movement during March on pricing. As I've said earlier, though, that's very general, and there will be lots of different things moving in slightly different directions. But I do think there will be more pressure than there has been, and you might be getting a movement down of maybe up to 1%, something like that. I think there will probably be more pressure once you sort of hit Easter in April. But at the moment, there would be some pressure, I think, during March. But it is also dependent on the timing of those new cars, and whether if they come towards the end of the month, then maybe that pressure isn't quite as acute as that. But I certainly don't think values are going to go up in March, with the obvious exception of maybe some convertibles and coupe cabriolets that will, if the sun's shining, then they may well do well.
Well, that's a good point, isn't it? Because spring's coming on, and there is that seasonal demand, isn't there?
Yeah, I think the weather has obviously been fairly unusual recently, which won't have helped consumers go out and buy a vehicle. So if you do get some improvement in those types of things, but then you start to head into sort of holiday seasons, and you can see that at the moment with sort of drop-offs during half terms, plus the weather doesn't really help that consumer demand. So it's certainly not all doom and gloom going forward. And I think that there will be some slight drops, but I mean, they've gone up by 30% over the year. It was never going to carry on in that vein. So there will be some price realignment happening, but it won't be a crash, and it won't be to a huge degree.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's a good point there. I mean, it's a negative minus 0.3 this month. If we do see that -1 or thereabouts into the next month, then you know what? It's still ahead of a normal depreciation month that we've seen in normal seasonal years. So, and we're coming from a very high point, aren't we? So you say it's nothing to be spooked or concerned. But as you've just demonstrated throughout this recording, Derren, it's the detail behind it, isn't it? There's increases and decreases demand for models, both by fuel type, by age profiles, and by now specifically by price bandings as well. So some good points there made. So, I mean, it remains me to say, as always, thanks for joining us today. Thanks for sharing your insight on the February market and both the values and trends that you've been seeing, and more importantly, setting the scene of what to expect in March as we head into the first plate month of the year. For those listening, just a reminder that if you do want to get sight of the editorial, if you haven't received it, it is available on the CAP HPI website. So you can head over there. It's cap-hpi.com, or reach out to Derren. Best place is LinkedIn for Derren, and Derren will certainly direct you to that or answer any questions you may have, or have a chat. But many thanks again, Derren, for coming back on, and I can't wait to get you back on in March as we see where that first quarter is looking out.
Yeah, that's a pleasure. I think every month at the moment is difficult to call, and it's almost more interesting than it was last year when everything was going up. So it's going to be an interesting year. So yeah, happy to come back next month.
Look after yourself, and we will speak soon.
Yeah, cheers, guys.
Thanks, Derren.
So again, there, very insightful and views from Derren, and some key points. I think the points made there with Derren about the price banding, as we alluded to at the start of the show, is a key element. Yeah. And one thing was clear, and you only need to look at the movements by age and mileage and by sector, that the 0.3% downward movement at 3 year 60 does not tell you the story. There is a lot of increases in there by age and by sector, as well as a lot of decreases, be it city car gone up at all plates, all mileages, but SUV very much dependent whether it's a small, medium, large or premium SUV. And the same for MPV. You asked the question, and yeah, unfortunately Zafira's now on the decline, guys.
Yeah, but did you hear? It's up 70%.
I know,
year
yes.
on year.
There is, yeah. I mean that's where and I work in data, and Derren's having that same issue now, that and we've referred to it many times, haven't we, through the podcast, particularly through the pandemic, when it starts doing a comparison either month on month or year on year. Certainly now when they're doing their comparison in terms of last year. We were in a soft lockdown with a click and collect environment in the main part of the UK last year. So the market has recovered. But as you say there, I mean, the Zafira has gone up 70%. Yeah. So I think it deserves to just have a rest for a bit, doesn't it? I think
it does, so. Yes, yeah. But you know what? We were talking to Derren about the media coverage, and we know that Derren and CAP HPI have been quoted widely in the national press. But I guess the point I'm getting to is that there's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of potential buyers who are now more aware of appreciation in used cars, to the point where someone contacted me last week to ask if it was worth their while staying out of the used car market for 6 months to wait for the prices to come crashing down. So I did actually respond, well, they're not going to come crashing down. There might be gentle shifts. But if you think you're going to save a lot of money in 6 months' time, you're not.
You're probably not. No, and they weren't looking after a Zafira, were they, by any chance? Listen to you talking about Zafiras all the time.
No, but I was tempted to try and buy one.
I think you missed that boat now. Yeah. I think it's that ship has sailed now, Curtis, unfortunately. But that's it for this week. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. Hopefully you get some insight there from the interview with Derren. Gives you a little bit of things to think about and look in that detail a little bit more in depth now with everything that's going on. And you can't necessarily wait a month to review the marketplace. This is changing daily, weekly now. So keep a close eye on it. And let's say if you need anything, then Derren's there to reach out to on LinkedIn. But if you do want to come on the podcast, please do, as Curtis always said at the start of the show, reach out. Find us on LinkedIn. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or email us at motortraderadio@yahoo.com, and we'll certainly either share your thoughts, your media, or even invite you onto the show. So please do get in touch.
But that's all for this week. You've been listening to the weekly Motor Trade Radio podcast powered by eBay Motors Group. Many thanks for joining us for all the chatter that matters. We're back again next week. Until then, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.